Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out here on a beautiful Saturday morning. I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Taylor Garr. I live in Chelsea. I am not a professional activist. I am an educator, but since we're not going to be talking about middle school science, this is not a professional gig for me. I am a volunteer with a group called We the People Massachusetts. We're an independent, grassroots, all-volunteer organization with chapters across the state. And I've been volunteering my time for the last 5 or 6 years, working on researching, learning about the topic that we're going to be talking about, and then trying to share that information with folks like you. So what we're going to go over today is a really big topic, and we're going to give you what is necessarily a sort of brief overview of it. We're going to look at the sort of back and forth of a struggle for power throughout American history between concentrated power and people power. We're going to give you a sense of where we are, what the state of our democracy is today, and what we can do about it. So the workshop is called Fixing Our Broken Democracy. So it makes sense to start out with getting on the same page about what does democracy mean? So when I say the word democracy, what comes to mind? How would you define it? One person, one vote, representative government, people power, equal opportunity. Great. I want to zoom in on where the word itself actually comes from. It's from the Attic Greek. Demos means people, kratia means power or rule, so you put them together and you get the idea that the people rule, this idea of people power. Now, you probably are aware we are not, strictly speaking, a direct democracy. We are a constitutional republic. But we are a constitutional republic founded on this idea, right? This spirit of democracy. So I want to just take a quick sort of temperature of the room here, thinking about what you know of the state of affairs today. How many people feel like we're really living up, especially at the national level, the federal level, how many people think our political process right now lives up to the ideal of the people ruling? Yeah. So we get that reaction everywhere we go. People have a general sense that our democracy is in dire need of repair. And it's one thing to know that on sort of a gut level, but for those of you, and it's especially easy to feel that way in the wake of an election where almost $7 billion were spent in order to get us to an outcome where almost half the people actually didn't vote, and where a meager just over a quarter of eligible voters are the ones who actually were responsible for putting someone into the White House. But for those of you who are more empirically minded and want some hard data, one place I like to start is, there are a lot of different ways to measure whether the people are in charge, whether the people are being represented. One snapshot that I like to take is of the economy and whether the economy is serving people. And if you look at this chart showing the distribution of average income growth during economic expansion. So when the economy is doing well, who's getting the new money that's being added to the economy? Go back to about 1950, and the top 10% of income earners, so these red bars are the top 10%, they took home about 20% of the new income. So twice what their share would be in a perfectly egalitarian world. And over time, decade after decade, their share has risen until the point where between 2009 and 2012, they actually took home more than 100% of the gains in the economy. The blue bar is for the bottom 90% of us, and you can see our share going down and down and down until we get to the point where the average American is actually falling farther behind, even as the economy expands and riches flow to those at the top. So another piece of data that you may have run across, average person you run into on the street will never have heard of this, but I'm wondering if there's anybody in the room who has seen these graphs before, has any context for them. Great. All right. Let me break them down for you here. So researchers at Princeton and Northwestern did a study a few years ago, and they went through and they looked at almost 2,000 policy outcomes. So everything that went through Congress and was voted on and either became law or didn't. And they compared that to reams and reams of public polling data to try and get a sense of what did the public want and what actually became law. And what they found was this depressingly flat line right here, showing that no matter how popular a policy was, from 0% to 100%, had the same likelihood of being enacted. I'll actually let someone else break this down. This is a video from Represent Us.
For the last few years, I've had this sense that everything I learned as a kid about how America's government works is completely wrong. But I had no idea how bad things actually were until I saw this one graph. Researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question. Does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left, at 0%, are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right, at 100%, are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. Put another way, and I'm just going to quote the Princeton study directly here, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it? We pay for it.
So, I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. Like I was saying at the beginning, that's a video put together by a group called Represent Us. They do great work on this topic. So the takeaway from this study is that America's actually an oligarchy, more of an oligarchy where an elite few are in charge than a democracy. What average citizens want doesn't matter. What the rich want is what becomes law. Now, that's not the ideal on which we were founded. Going back to the founding of our country, we outlined the broad strokes of what the American political system is supposed to do. Going back to our founding documents, we had Thomas Jefferson, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, writing that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, that was the, flawed ideal. Sorry, ladies, but if you're a man, you're considered equal theoretically under the law. This was a big step forward for its time, and it's the ideal that has continued to inspire us for generations. But we've had to fight to get closer and closer to that ideal over time, and that's what a lot of this presentation will be about. We have, of course, the Constitution, and here's sort of the backbone of what it lays out for how our political system is supposed to work. We start with us, right? With we the people. And the people are what's known as sovereign, meaning they are the ones with ultimate power, ultimate authority. We have rights which are inalienable, which are inherent to us, and which are actually meant to protect us from overreach of government and from the abuse of power by concentrated power in general. And then from the people, from the consent of the governed, is where we get government. And government is not actually sovereign, it's a representative body that has whatever duties, whatever powers we come together and imbue it with. So I want to focus in specifically on this idea of rights. After the Constitution, was drafted, there were a number of states, including Massachusetts, who said, we're not ready to sign on to this thing and ratify it unless rights are specifically spelled out and protected for citizens. And so Madison drafted what ended up becoming the Bill of Rights, these first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So the Constitution was passed, it was ratified, and then these were added on. These were the first changes to this living document that has continued to change over time. We have the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, due process, some of the most important rights and protections that we enjoy ever since then. Molly Ivins talked about the Constitution this way and American history this way. She said, it's possible to read the history of this country as one long struggle to extend the liberties established in our Constitution to everyone in America. Because you probably are aware, not everyone was entitled to those at first. When the Constitution was written, it actually only was referring to white male landowners, property owners, which at the time comprised about 5% of the population. So when it said all men are created equal, these men were created equal in the eyes of the founders. And then over time, people have banded together and fought in order to expand this definition of rights and to be included in the umbrella of who is a person. From the abolition of slavery and the extension of suffrage to black males, to the labor movement, which fought for the rights of workers, including ending child labor. We had the decades-long struggle for women's suffrage. More recently, the civil rights movement fighting to make this idea of equal protection under the law something closer to an actual reality. One of the big steps forward in this series of fights was the 14th Amendment. After the abolition of slavery, it took an amendment to the Constitution to establish what's known as the Due Process Clause, saying that all people, all persons, are equal under the law. This is going to play an important role later in our story, so we're going to come back to it then. Early in our days, we've got some fantastic stories that we're all aware of. Not far from here, we had the Boston Tea Party. Does anybody actually know who the tea belonged to that was dumped into the harbor? It was British tea, right? It must have belonged to the British government. It's the East India Company, right? It belonged to the biggest corporation of the day. And what people were rebelling against, actually, in the case of the Tea Party, was not a new tax on them. They were actually rebelling against a corporate tax break, right? And so the revolution itself, yeah. So the revolution itself was actually, and the Tea Party itself was an economic direct action against not just a tyrannical government, but the interlocking power of the state and the corporations that were just incredibly interwoven and embedded in the political structure of the day. So going back to the Constitution, it actually doesn't mention the word corporation anywhere. But we're going to need to talk about corporations in the course of this, so we got to figure out where they come in and fit into the picture. Corporations are not mentioned in the Constitution because in the debates around the Constitution and in that first Congress, it was assumed corporations were going to be able to be kept in check by local government. Because it's actually local government, state government, that gives rise to corporations in the first place. So we have our schematic here. We the people are sovereign. From the consent of the governed comes government. Then at the state level, government actually wills corporations into existence. With a piece of paper, a legal act, they create this otherwise imaginary entity, right? An artificial entity where people can pool their resources and then get a totally different legal status in order to engage in certain behaviors. In these early days, corporations were viewed a little bit differently. This is a clip from a video called Story of Citizens United versus the FEC by Annie Leonard and the folks who created another video called The Story of Stuff, which went viral a while back. This is well worth watching the whole thing, but we'll just watch a little snippet of it.
When the United States came into existence, corporations were easier to keep in check. Back then, the government would grant them charters for a specific short-term project, like building a bridge or a railroad. Once they fulfilled their purpose, they were disbanded. But over time, the law changed, and corporations no longer had to be turned off once their project was complete. they began to live on indefinitely with a much more general purpose: profit. And that's how the modern corporation was born.
At the time, in the first few decades of American history, corporations were kept on a really tight leash. If they did something that ran contrary to the charter that brought them into existence, the state government would revoke that charter, the corporation would be no more. At that point, charters only lasted a certain number of years. There was an expiration date. And there were laws against corporations owning other corporations, all sorts of things that have since changed. And I bet you can guess part of the process that went into getting those things changed. Even in these early days, by the time Thomas Jefferson was president, he was already seeing the concentration of corporate power, and he was already skeptical of it. This is my favorite quote from him. He said, "I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial by strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country." Already in 1816. Now, over time, those protections against the sort of growth and abuse of corporate power that I just laid out for you were stripped away, peeled away. Throughout the 1800s, a lot of this had to do with the rise of the railroads and their power and their influence in government, especially around the time of the Civil War. And we continue to see today that war is good business, right? So, boo hiss indeed. So during this time, right around the time that the 14th Amendment was passed that we referred to earlier, and the tragic irony of all this is that as corporations were whittling away at all of these restrictions on what they could do, they had their eyes on a bigger prize, right? They wanted the rights of human beings for themselves. So how would they go about getting that? Well, their entry point, their tool was the 14th Amendment, which was supposed to protect newly freed slaves and their inalienable rights, which had not been recognized until then. Instead of being used to protect those people, in the first few decades after the 14th Amendment was passed, the vast majority of cases that went before the Supreme Court on the grounds of the 14th Amendment were brought by corporations, many of them the railroad corporations of the day that were so powerful, they had all these resources, they were able to go to court again and again and say, we demand the rights of people, because we are people. And time after time, the Supreme Court struck that argument down. But corporations are persistent. The reason it got struck down was for a long time, going back before America was a country, there had been an understanding in legal theory that there's this distinction between the kind of personhood that a corporation has, this legal personhood where, so here's how a corporation works. People come together, they decide we want to act together in a business function, we want to pool our resources, we want to be able to be shielded from some of the complexity of having a bunch of individual relationships. And so in order to function as a business, we need to be able to act as a single person in order to enter into a contract, in order to file a lawsuit, that sort of thing. That's how corporations work, and it's really important in the economic sphere. We're not trying to change that, right? But that is a far cry from the idea of being a person with constitutional rights. This was never intended to be the kind of personhood that these artificial entities possessed. These are our rights that were supposed to be inalienable. You know, if you're like Jefferson, you think that they come from our Creator. So if the state is creating the corporation, then it should be the state that is the only one with the power to give it rights or privileges. So railroads going to court, fighting their way into a broader and broader range of protections. A lot of this happened in what's known as the Gilded Age. You guys have heard of the Gilded Age, right? So we have these robber barons, right? Who were the people in charge during the Gilded Age? It was the railroad tycoons and a bunch of other industrial barons who sent their lobbyists to stalk up and down the halls of Congress and bribe politicians with gifts or with money in order to get the legislative outcomes that benefited them. It was a time of incredible wealth, but also extreme poverty, just a ton of inequality. I'm sure none of that sounds familiar to people living in 2017, right?
In Lexington.
Right. We bring this up because it's important, I think, for us to remember that it has been this bad before. And when things got really bad during the Gilded Age, there came a tipping point, and people started to get fed up, and they started to band together to turn the tables, right? We, the people, rose up, and we saw a series of just incredible insurgent people's movements that rose up and demanded really fundamental changes to our legal and political structure. I'm just going to briefly touch on a bunch of them. We had the People's Party, the Populists, back around the turn of the century. You had trust buster Teddy Roosevelt, the progressive, who said, there can be no effective control of corporations while their political activity remains. He signed the Tillman Act in 1907, which banned corporations from spending in elections. He said the great corporations, which we've grown to speak of rather loosely as trusts, are the creatures of the state. And the state not only has the right to control them, but it is duty-bound to control them wherever the need of such control is shown. Now, that's not the way that we are used to hearing corporations described. There's been a whole concerted effort to rewrite our understanding of this power dynamic, right? We had the decades-long struggle of women to be able to share in the political process and be able to vote. And interestingly enough, how many of you know that in order to win the right to vote, they actually had to pass an amendment because they had to overcome a Supreme Court decision that said that they couldn't have the right to vote. So that's what amendments are for, right? Is to fix things that can't otherwise be fixed through the normal political channels. You had the labor movement, which fought for decades during its heyday. People were out there getting bloodied in the streets, fighting to expand their rights and to tip this balance of power back away from the consolidated economic power of these corporations. You had the civil rights movement, people just flocking to D.C. for the March on Washington. This is where the I Have a Dream speech was given. This is one of my favorites. Earth Day 1970. When I learned this, I could not believe it. Having grown up in the era when I have grown up, the first Earth Day, there were 20 million Americans in the streets. I can't remember the last time that 500,000 people came out for something. I guess the protests against the invasion of Iraq were the last thing that even had 1 million people spread out across the country. 20 million people just absolutely dwarfs that. And people came out in cities all across the country just in throngs to say, no, these corporations that have been just running roughshod over our environment and our protections in order to amass their profits, they're not going to get to control everything anymore. And we had a raft of legislation that came out of that movement because there were so many people coming together in that movement. We saw the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and that has really defined environmental law for the decades since, and is now being dismantled piece by piece. Here's another clip that I want to show you, because as all these people's movements were rising up and creating these changes and expanding people's power, you know that made the people in positions of wealth and power nervous, right? They were seeing their grip start to slide, and they were seeing the power of people when they come together. And of course, there was a backlash.
A decision was reached by corporate America that working with unions, working with government to improve the standard of living for all people was not the right thing to do.
Big business doesn't like the government to tell it what to do. They don't want anybody to interfere with their ability to make money in the way that they see fit.
In 1971, corporate leaders began to orchestrate a detailed battle plan to eliminate any government policies that might stand between them and profits. The plan was laid out in an influential memo called Attack on American Free Enterprise System.
Lewis Powell was a well-respected citizen of Richmond, Virginia. He was a corporate lawyer, a partner in a prestigious corporate law firm, and friends with an executive at the Chamber of Commerce named Eugene Sydnor. And Sydnor asked his friend if he would draft a position statement that he could submit to the Chamber of Commerce that would then sort of form the framework for how to make the organization more able to confront what they thought was a growing threat to business interests.
Powell's memo laid out a strategy to radically alter public perceptions, ensuring that big business interests would dominate public policy. Powell advocated a vast purge of liberal elements in society. He saw how corporate money could own the media and talk louder than organized labor and consumer protection groups. But for Powell, a future Supreme Court justice, the real end game was business control of law and politics.
Now, I know that narration makes it sound like we're being really conspiratorial and making him sound all sinister with that ominous music in the background, but it's right there in the paper that he wrote. It really is a battle plan saying, we've got to take things over, and here's how we do it, and here's how we use the Supreme Court, among other things, to tip the scales in our favor. It was a comprehensive battle plan. We got it labeled as a Chamber of Commerce plan here. Lewis Powell wrote it, but he was very enmeshed with the Chamber of Commerce, which we'll come back to later because they still hold an incredible amount of sway. This battle plan included media, politics, courts, and think tanks. And here you can see, this is right when the Powell memo was written, and this is the number of think tanks. And the explosion here was largely in the kind of think tanks that he was proposing. So he actually called the creation of corporate rights an instrument for social, economic, and political change. And he said an activist Supreme Court is our biggest weapon. It was Nixon who put him on the court. And when he went to the Supreme Court, he showed up the first day with a robe that had been given to him by, anybody know this story? Philip Morris, the tobacco company. So over the years, we have seen the Bill of Rights that Madison drafted, these 10 enumerated protections of the inalienable rights of all of us. We've seen them attacked in the courts and whittled away and sold off so that they protect corporations. This creates a kind of equal protection, because remember, it all started with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment that maybe looks something more like this. If you want to learn more about the specifics of this part of the story, I highly encourage you to read our favorite, must-read book. Jeff Clements is from not too far from here, and he literally wrote the book on corporate constitutional rights called "Corporations Are Not People." I believe we've got a copy of it back there on the table. Jeff recently has created an organization called American Promise, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. They're in the middle of collecting signatures for a ballot question that's aimed at driving us closer to an amendment. So one of the things that Jeff talks about in his book that's just so illuminating is what he calls the corporate veto. And so the idea of a corporate veto is that you go through the normal political process, right? People weigh in, they advocate for what they want with their legislators. Legislators debate things, they pass a law, and sometimes you actually do end up with laws that are in the public interest, right? It may feel like it's really rare these days, but they get passed, and then a corporation comes along and says, nah, I'm not okay with that. That's going to cut into my profits, so I'm going to go to court, and I'm going to say, this law unfairly impinges on my, as a corporation, constitutional rights, and they get it overturned. They get it struck down as unconstitutional. There's a specific story in the book from here in Massachusetts where a tobacco company went to court and they challenged a Massachusetts law that put restrictions on the advertisement of tobacco products within 1,000 feet of a school or playground. Tobacco company went to court and they said, that's a violation of this company's right to free speech. Law got struck down. And that was when, you recognize Joe Camel, right? These cigarette companies, they knew what they were doing. They had the research showing it was bad for people. They knew that they were actually killing off their clientele. And so ever since then, with the the racketeering and conspiracy litigation has unearthed these internal memos that showed that they were targeting what they called replacement smokers. So they had this coordinated campaign to try and go after children, and Massachusetts was trying to protect children from that, and this is how it played out, because they were able to claim that constitutional right to free speech. We can't go through this without touching on campaign finance. Money in politics is one huge element in this story, and it was during the 70s with Powell on the bench that a number of decisions were written. He was usually the author of them, that struck down restrictions on the way that money was raised and spent in elections. The one that sort of kicked everything off to a large degree was called Buckley versus Valeo. This is where we get the idea that money is speech. It said that candidates can spend unlimited amounts of money on their campaigns. You can't restrict that in any way. Some people think that that's a really principled stand to take, but gosh, I can't imagine a world where we end up with billionaires running for office and trying to fund their own campaigns. You know, I don't know about you, I really can't wait for Trump versus Zuckerberg 2020. This is going to be great. And then 2 years later, we actually had a Massachusetts case called First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, and this struck down, a Massachusetts law that put restrictions on the way that corporations spent money on ballot initiatives. So this is stuff that was directly in their business interest, and they were flooding ballot questions to try and turn public opinion against anything that might cut into their profits. There was a law against it. It got struck down, and I mean, you guys have been around for some of the election cycles recently where ballot questions had millions and millions of dollars poured in from out of state. I know the bottle bill from a cycle or two ago had multinational beverage companies funneling millions of dollars in to try and defeat it, and they ended up actually completely flipping public opinion in the months leading up to the election. And most infamously in the world of campaign finance, we have, of course, Citizens United from 2010. And this opinion, written by the moderate Justice Anthony Kennedy, allowed unlimited outside spending, including by corporations. Now, what really gets me about the majority ruling in Citizens United is his reasoning is that this unlimited influx of unaccountable outside money into the political process, not only does it not create corruption, but it doesn't even create the appearance of corruption, and so we have no interest in regulating it. And I don't know what planet he has grown up on, but not every justice was on board. It was a 5-4 decision, and we had Justice John Paul Stevens, who wrote a blistering 90-page dissent. It's actually well worth your time to go get it and read it. But in there he said things like, corporations help structure and facilitate the activities of human beings, to be sure, and their personhood often serves as a useful legal fiction. This is what I broke down for you earlier. But they are not themselves members of we the people, by whom and for whom our Constitution was established. Now, not long after Citizens United, 2014, we had another decision handed down, McCutcheon versus FEC. Now, this struck down the aggregate limits on how much a person could donate. If you add up what they give to all these different candidates, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple $100,000. And some people just really said, you're handcuffing me here. I can only spend a couple $100,000. And so they struck it down, and you have this tidal wave of money unleashed, right? You've got some people putting in $5.9 million to influence as many politicians as they can, and then you've got people giving $27 to a campaign, and those are supposed to be able to compete with each other. I'd like to point out down here below the dam, if you can't read it from where you are, this is the average citizen down here in the rowboat, right? And we like to throw in some political cartoons because you can talk and talk and talk, but sometimes the best way to get this across is just with the emotional punch of political cartoons, right? One of the things that happened in the wake of Citizens United was the creation of this new thing called a super PAC that had more unlimited powers to spend unaccountable money than anyone had had before. And almost all of super PAC spending these days is negative. It's these attack ads that are just meant to turn everybody off. It's how you end up getting 40% of people sitting out an election. you have this idea that corporations, even global corporations, right, with investors who are all around the world, they get to speak to whatever their interests are. They get to pump money into the system to represent themselves, right? And so, of course, we go from a design where Congress is supposed to be beholden to the people, accountable to the people, and instead you have this situation where, Congress, because they are the ones who need to raise the most money in order to stay in office. I mean, you've probably heard the statistic about the ridiculous percentage of their time that is spent dialing for dollars. They don't like it, but it's the system that they're in, and they become beholden to the already wealthiest and most powerful elements of our society. Corporations, I already mentioned that the ones who spend the most on our political system often are global corporations with tendrils that exist all over the world. They don't actually have like a home, a residency here. A lot of them are located overseas to not pay taxes, and but they have these subsidiaries that operate here, and they can funnel money through them. And so, do we really think that these corporate persons have any sort of loyalty or any sort of ideals the way you and I have? Again, Justice Stevens spoke to some of these concerns. He said, talking about Citizens United, the majority decision affords the same protection to multinational corporations controlled by foreigners as to individual Americans. And so we have this situation where there are certain corporations that are really able to take advantage of these legal loopholes that have been created. But most corporations are not big behemoths, right? And you actually have small businesses, which research has shown are actually the engine of job growth and a healthy economy. It's not the big corporations that have merged and bought everyone up, right? To have a healthy economy, we need small businesses. There have been surveys of small business owners that show that an overwhelming majority of them think that this idea of corporate constitutional rights and the flood of money into politics is bad for them and bad for their business. Because they're not the ones with lobbyists, fleets of lobbyists walking the halls of Congress. So we've gone through this whole history. We've seen the back and forth, the power struggle, and we've ended up in a position where after all of these struggles to expand the notion of who is a person, who has rights, we've gotten to the point where all of these people are now, at least nominally under the law, considered people. Now we've created this whole other kind of person. And in the end, we end up crowded out of the political process. So we return to our schematic of how American democracy is supposed to work, and we find that it has changed. Corporations, which were a product all the way down here created at the bottom of the totem pole, have now moved up beside us on equal footing in terms of rights, but they also have all of these special privileges and powers due to their charters. They can exist in multiple places at once. They can live forever. They can do things that you and I can't do. And so when we give them our rights as well, we end up with a situation where instead of we the people, we have we the corporations. Or I like to think of it as, especially since they moved to Boston recently, you're welcome for your multi-billion-dollar tax break, GE the people. So it's time for us to talk about the big issue in our moment in American political history, right? The election that we just went through. $6.9 billion spent for the outcome that we showed you before, where a huge number of Americans just sat it out. And a minority of eligible voters ended up controlling the outcome. I don't suppose anybody in here can think of any other way to spend $6.9 billion that might work out better. In this process, we've seen our familiar player here, the Chamber of Commerce, Lewis Powell's organization that he was so tight with. In 2016 alone, they spent about $30 million on the political, on the election process. About half of that was against Democrats, and almost the whole other half was for Republicans. They're lobbying for the interests of these giant corporations. So they pump money into the elections themselves, but then after the elections are over, they continue to pump money into the politicians. You can see their lobbying expenditures have been pretty steady over the last decade, $100 million a year. Election or no election, they're lobbying to create that result that you saw in our first video, right? They are lobbying to maintain that flat line where we don't get to determine the outcome. One of the products of this specifically, and I'm an earth science teacher, so this is something that I am very deeply familiar with and passionate about and endlessly frustrated by. There can be no meaningful action on climate change as long as the fossil fuel companies have the kind of power that they have. Here's a quote from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Republicans are trapped, right? Even if they wanted to do the right thing. The merciless might of the fossil fuel industry's new post-Citizens United political armaments is directed at them. Try to take on the fossil fuel companies, see what happens. You've seen this incredible growth taking off of what's known as outside spending. So this is instead of the party saying, hey, we're this party, we want you to vote for our candidate, it's these organizations with names like Americans for Apple Pie and Puppies, and they come in and they dump in all of this money. You don't know who they are or who they represent, but they've gone from a few $1 million per election cycle to almost $1.5 billion, and it's just going to keep rising from there. Why does this money being pumped into the elections matter? Well, you get pretty clear results. 94% of Senate races were won by the biggest spender in 2016, 96% of House races. So money doesn't always guarantee results, but it sure makes a difference. In 2016, just this pair of brothers alone and the network of people that they funnel money from, the Koch brothers said that they were going to try to spend $1 billion. And then they said, no, we're going to walk that back a little bit. Just $750 million in one election cycle. But it's not just the Koch brothers. It's not just a Republican problem, right? There is corruption throughout the system because it's not so much about the individual people, but about the system that people have managed to build over time. In 2016, liberal super PACs spent $440 million. Conservatives outspent them, but there's money flooding in on all sides. So we end up with this battle of the billionaires, where an incredibly small slice of the population is driving and funding the majority of political activity. Just 135 people in a country of 300 million. They each gave more than $1 million to outside groups, and they ended up making up a huge proportion of the overall spending. Top three, two of them are actually Democrats. Tom Steyer spent $86 million. I actually just saw an ad that he produced yesterday. He's put $10 million into it to try and rally people around impeachment. You may be totally for that and think it's a great idea. It's still billionaires versus billionaires fighting to see who gets to win that football game, Tom Steyer, Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, Donald Sussman. These are people who have started to become household names. The Kochs, Robert Mercer. You've probably heard of a number of these. A lot of the money is actually coming through what's called a dark money group, which is supposed to be a social welfare organization, not explicitly a political organization. But they can do a ton of political work as long as nobody's there to enforce it. And right now we have no enforcement of the regulations that still exist. They're being peeled off one by one, and the people who are tasked with enforcing them aren't doing it anyway. One Nation, which is just this one particular dark money group, looking at this, I would have no idea what they stand for. You got to really do your digging to figure out who's behind them and what they want. They spent $40 million to protect GOP control of the Senate. They don't have to disclose where any of their money comes from. So you can actually, with this case, you can do all the digging you want and still have no idea. The popular reaction to all of this is reflected in cartoons like this one, where only those who can afford it really have a voice in public affairs. But I think I've probably depressed you enough. Let's get back to the idea of all of us, right? What can we do? We, the people, have come together, like we saw time and time again throughout our history, to demand not just little tinkering here and there, but really fundamental changes to tip the balance of power back in our favor. You know, the Gilded Age didn't last forever. What we're living through right now is not going to last forever either. But it's up to us to make that change. It's up to us to keep marching closer and closer to this ideal of people, all people, being the ones with the rights. So generation after generation, people's movements have come together, and the ones that have affected really fundamental change have all used the tool of a constitutional amendment. Going back to 1776, just because I brought up Jefferson again, our ideals came from this incredible feat where a ragtag group of people who were up against the biggest political, military, economic powerhouse in the world were able to win in the end, right? These vagabonds coming onto the ship, throwing the tea overboard, they helped spark something that changed world history. So when you think about how difficult this road seems, take heart, right? Because we've been there before. So I want to talk specifically about constitutional amendments and why we're proposing that as the remedy to this. They are what have been used time and time again to solve the most pernicious problems of our political system, right? Starting with the Bill of Rights, the end of slavery, equal protection, women's suffrage, lowering the voting age so that you weren't going to be sent off to war but then get back and not be able to participate in the political process. And sometimes amendments have been used specifically to correct mistakes that the Supreme Court has made. As we evolve as a society and as a people, right, our understanding of rights and values changes. And sometimes we look back and we say, man, some of us may have known it all along that they were wrong, right? But we've gotten to the point where enough of us can agree that the Supreme Court got something wrong that we're going to come together to change it. And an amendment is the ultimate tool to do that. So we had the Dred Scott decision. We had the decision that I mentioned earlier that said women just did not have the right to vote and could not be legislated into voting. So that's what we need now is an amendment to do that. The 28th Amendment for democracy. So the group that I'm here representing, We the People Massachusetts, believes very strongly that this 28th Amendment, in order to be effective and in order to be the solution that we need to all of those ills that we've just gone over, needs to involve two core principles and have them explicitly laid out. You hear these referred to in shorthand as corporations aren't people, money is not speech. What it really, when we get down to the details of it, what it means is the rights protected by the Constitution are the rights of natural persons only, you and I, right? Corporations, artificial entities do not have constitutional rights. And then two, the spending of money to influence elections is not protected free speech under the First Amendment, and therefore Congress and the states may regulate it and should regulate it. I'm going to talk about several different prongs of what we can do to get us towards an amendment. I'm going to start very briefly with Congress itself. There are several different versions, actually, of a 28th Amendment, but there's this version in particular, the We the People Amendment, that has been introduced in Congress. There's very little likelihood at this moment that Congress is going to be willing to pass an amendment like this, but you don't get there without doing the work. And so one of the things that our volunteer members have been doing is actually going and meeting with the Massachusetts congressional delegation, and they've gotten 5 new co-sponsors on board just in the last few months. That's one vehicle to get us there, and it's the one that has always been used. Ultimately, amendments have come through Congress. It's like the primary way to get to an amendment is Congress passes it. You need 2/3 in the House, 2/3 in the Senate, and then it goes out to the states for ratification. So we're trying to build momentum in Congress, even if we've got a long way to go. Oh, here's what I was just laying out. So all of the amendments that we've gotten so far have ultimately come through this route. 2/3 of the members of the House and the Senate agree on them. But the other way that an amendment can be put forward is when the states come together and say, you know what, Congress isn't doing their job, we're going to have a convention, we're going to propose an amendment. We're going to get into the details of that in just a second. And I also want to mention, I mentioned American Promise a little bit earlier. They're working on a ballot question right now. I'll come back to that after this piece of legislation. So at the state level, the main thing that we the people of Massachusetts have been spending our time on recently is what's called the We the People Act. This has been introduced in this session of the Massachusetts legislature. So this is at the state level, trying to ramp up pressure and build momentum towards an amendment. So what this does is it has Massachusetts call on Congress for this amendment that proposes the two planks that I laid out to you, the core principles. And then it says if Congress fails to propose this amendment within 6 months, which, I mean, come on, this act would put Massachusetts on record calling for a convention of states, so the other route to get to a proposed amendment, for the purpose of proposing our specific amendment. Now, I'm gonna actually just go ahead and tackle head on some of the questions that people tend to have, because there are some groups out there who are liberal and progressive groups who have come out pretty strongly saying we think that a convention is not the way to go. And I think this argument is based on to give them the benefit of the doubt that it's all genuine. I think it's based on well-intentioned but really misunderstood reasoning, a poor reading of the legal history and legal theory around a convention. So why would we even take this step? Well, asking Congress to propose an amendment isn't working. We're still lobbying them. We're still getting more people on board. We've got 19 states already calling on Congress for an amendment. The convention was, what the last slide showed you, was the convention is the tool that was built into the Constitution in case Congress was the problem, and in case Congress was never going to propose the amendment that you need. So state after state after state, this is all in the wake of Citizens United. So in the last 5 or 6, 7 years, states have been adding themselves to this list. You'll see Massachusetts is already on this list. And they said, Congress, we want this amendment. Please pass this. So you can imagine how much that means to Congress. So we need some other leverage. We need a better tool to actually spur Congress to action. The convention route is our best leverage to pressure them, and believe it or not, it has worked before. I told you that every amendment that we've had so far has come out of Congress, but that's not how they all started. The 17th Amendment gave us the direct election of senators. How many people are familiar with the fact that senators used to be appointed by party machines in smoky back rooms? You could vote for your representative in the House, but not for your senator. Reformers fought for decades to get this passed, and they got it through the House. The House said, yeah, absolutely, let's, have a democracy. And they kept getting stymied in the Senate because who wants to bite the hand that feeds them? That's how they got there, was they were appointed, and they're not going to change it. And it took states, activists going to the states and organizing at the state level to call for a convention. And they got state after state on board. They got to within one state of triggering a convention, reaching that threshold. And you'll never guess what the Senate did next. Oh, we'll take it from here. We got it. Thanks. We got the message. But so that it works. And it's not just the 17th Amendment. 4 out of our last 10 amendments have actually started as convention calls in the states. So we think that it's a tool with a really proven track record of pressuring Congress. There's precedent even here in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts legislature has issued this kind of call for a convention many times before. One of them was in 1931. It called for a convention as part of the state-led political movement that ultimately led to the repeal of Prohibition. The We the People Act explicitly also restricts the convention call to our topic. So this is actually probably the biggest question or biggest concern that people have is like, well, how do you know that it's actually going to give us the amendment that you are calling the convention to propose? Well, That's the only thing it possibly could do, and it's written very explicitly into the language of the We the People Act. I'm not going to read the whole thing, the whole text on the slide here for you, but it calls for a limited convention for the exclusive purpose of proposing the specific amendments that are described in all of the whereas and whereas. It lays out basically all the problems that I've gone through in this presentation. It mentions Citizens United and McCutcheon there. It says, this petition shall not be considered until 33 other states submit petitions for the same purpose, and a convention shall be limited to the same purpose requested by Massachusetts. So there's no way that this could end up with a convention that decides, oh, actually, we're here to meet and propose a balanced budget amendment. It would not be in their legal authority to do that. I'm not a lawyer. What I can tell you is a ton of legal scholars have looked into this. In the 80s, we were getting close to a convention call for the balanced budget amendment, and so the Department of Justice had their lawyers dig into this and do some research, and they produced, I think this is a 64-page report that says very clearly, yes, conventions can be limited to a single topic. The American Bar Association, the Congressional Research Service, and leading legal scholars like Lawrence Lessig, who you may have heard of at Harvard Law, are all on record saying, yes, absolutely, this is clearly what's in both the language of Article 5 and in all of the language, the records that we have of the debate that went into the Constitution. And courts often take that kind of context into consideration. What is the intent of the law? How are people discussing it when it was written? I can't sit here and spell out for you 64 pages worth of legalese that the Department of Justice came up with, but I think they make a pretty strong case. And ultimately, let's say you're still not convinced by that. And you're like, yeah, but if there's any fraction of a chance that the convention could say, we're not gonna do this, we're gonna exceed our mandate, we're gonna consider other topics, even though conventions have happened 233 times at the state level to amend state constitutions, and none of them have ever exceeded their mandate. Let's say you're still not convinced. Even if the convention decided to take up another topic and decided to propose some other amendment, neither Congress nor the convention can actually amend the Constitution. The process doesn't end there. All they can do is propose one, and then it still has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Now, even with as lopsided as things have started to get now, and the GOP is at the apex of its power, they still are not close to having the power to ratify on their own. Right? All it takes is one chamber in the legislature of 13 states to keep an amendment from being ratified. So what that means is amendments are the hardest thing to do in American politics, and they take an actual movement being built, and they take an incredible amount of agreement across the political spectrum. I'll come back to that agreement across the political spectrum in just a second as we wrap up. Lastly, if you're going to refuse to pursue a path because there's some minuscule risk that things could go wrong, you're not ever going to make political change, especially the kind of fundamental political change that we need. There's no path to reform that doesn't involve some struggle and risk, and there is an enormous amount of risk inherent in just letting business as usual continue. So momentum is building for a convention. Out of those 19 states, 5 of them have now upped the ante by saying, not only are we calling on you for an amendment, but if you don't propose it, we want a convention. We want to add Massachusetts to that list because as the cradle of American democracy, we have this incredible legacy that we're standing on, and we really feel like Massachusetts should be at the vanguard of this movement. So, the We the People Act is currently in a committee. It's in 2 committees on Beacon Hill. One of the committees just had a hearing. The other one is having a hearing coming up soon, Paul, on November 8th. 2 o'clock. Yeah. And so that's a chance for citizens to come and testify in support of the bill. They've actually booked us a room that's doubly large compared to where they normally do these because they anticipate so much support coming in for this bill. Right now, we currently have 71 members of the House who have either signed on as co-sponsors, or a few of them missed the deadline but have sent letters of formal support. So they're, we call them co-sponsors or supporters. You can check to see if your member is on there. We can also follow up with you at the end. We've got half the Senate at this point, 20 Senate co-sponsors. And one thing to keep in mind with these numbers is that people who are in leadership in these chambers generally don't sponsor bills, don't sign on to other people's bills, because they stay back just to let the process unfold, but it doesn't mean that they wouldn't vote for them. So you can see we're like getting close to the threshold that we would need in order to pass this. And so what it takes is really strongly advocating with your representatives to get the ones who are not on the list yet to join. So that was the amendment in Congress, the We the People amendment. That was the local legislation, the state legislation we're working on, the We the People Act. And there's a parallel effort going on, and we actually have, as you came in, you probably saw, we have some petitions for a ballot question that has been sort of spearheaded by this organization called American Promise. American Promise emerged recently in this landscape of organizations fighting for this amendment, and their mission is, we're going to support whatever efforts, whatever movements we can to get this amendment done. And here in Massachusetts, they've decided that a ballot question, a ballot initiative, is actually the tool that they wanted to use and thought would be most effective. So what this ballot question would do, their effort is here in Massachusetts is called the People Govern, Not Money ballot question. And what the question would do, if it passes, is create a citizens commission to study this question of an amendment and to educate people and to advocate for it. So it would be explicitly building in the voice of the people in the process. So a ballot question is a huge lift, right? You need, given the number of signatures that usually get rejected, people say you need around 90,000. It gets done every single year. There are a number of ballot questions that don't make it, and a number of questions that do. And I mentioned that Massachusetts has this incredible legacy. That's not just going all the way back to the founding era. In this current fight, Massachusetts has shown a lot of leadership. Less so our representatives and more the actual people here in Massachusetts. There have been volunteers from a number of organizations that have fanned out across the country. I was speaking to someone in the audience here already who said she was out collecting signatures years ago, a few years ago. We've done a number of ballot questions that are non-binding. So rather than the statewide 90,000 signature one that has to actually create some sort of new law, there's also this non-binding, what's called an advisory question, where you get to collect signatures in a district to put that question on the ballot in that district, and then everyone gets to vote on the question in order to signal what they want to the legislators. And every township, municipality that you see here that has some sort of color to it is one that either has passed that ballot question. People have gone out and collected signatures in that district, and then every single district where it has gotten on the ballot, it has passed by supermajorities, whether they voted Republican or Democrat. Or some of the other colors here are local resolutions. And here's where Massachusetts has really shown some incredible leadership. There are more than, I think, 700 towns and cities across the country that have passed local resolutions calling for the 28th Amendment. 200 of them are in Massachusetts. So we want to really build on that work and keep Massachusetts pushing the ball forward and building momentum. I mentioned that the only way an amendment is going to get ratified is if it cuts across the political spectrum. This issue has incredibly cross-partisan support. You see here between 2/3 and 90% of Republicans, Democrats, and independents support this amendment. And you can see that in all different polls that have been taken consistently year after year. Here's one from CBS and the New York Times. The influence of money in political campaigns. 80 to 90% of people think that there is too much influence of money in political campaigns, whether you're a member of this party, that party, or no party, right? Another question in another poll, are changes needed to the way political campaigns are funded in the United States? The overwhelming majority say yeah, and not just changes, but fundamental changes, or we need to completely rebuild this system. So the interest is there. People understand the problem. People want the solution. What's missing is people understanding that there is a solution waiting for them, and that all they have to do is go out and reach for it. So there is a growing democracy movement. I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years in my spare time, and it's been amazing to watch this sort of tidal wave slowly building across the country. The final part of the presentation, which is my favorite, which is what can we actually do about this? We've got a number of things that are available for you here. We're going to have folks come around and hand them out to you. One is a volunteer sheet. Gives you a lot of specific action items that you can check off if you think you would be able to do those. One that we've got sort of a starred here is joining a meeting with your state legislators. If they are not on that list that I showed you before, the most important thing that I think you could do right now is to join with us to meet them, and we've got a whole process for it. We can help set up the meeting, find other constituents in your district to go in and have. I've now met with my senator and my representative, and it's really an amazing process if you've never done that before. It's a cool thing to experience. We've got postcards where you can also send your message to your state senator, your state representative from afar, if you're not able to go and meet with them in person. And this presentation, which actually comes in a number of different forms, we can chop it up and make it shorter. I wanted to give you guys the full sort of gamut of information, but we've got flyers here that you can use to go around and advertise for workshops or presentations in other spaces. So if there's a group you know who would be interested in having one of us come and present, and you can tell us how much time you want to allot for it, or if there's a venue where you want to pull people together, we're happy to come anywhere and do this anytime. So I want to leave you with the question of what will our legacy be? And I know it seems like a big task. I know there's a lot that seems discouraging about it. But I hope that I've also shown you that throughout history there are a lot of shining examples of what can be done, and that you're motivated at this point to roll up your sleeves and plug in somewhere to help us get this done. So thank you so much, and we'll move into a question and answer phase now. So the question is about what is the actual roadmap to triggering a convention or getting close enough. We've got 19 states who have called for an amendment. 5 of those have also called for a convention. So let's say we get the rest of that 19 on board. We still have to get to 34 states in order for a convention. So the question was, have we gone through and looked at the remaining states and identified where the best prospects are, and laid out what the path forward is? So the answer is yes and no. Our group in particular is a Massachusetts-based organization, and so we've been focusing on how can we do our part here. But there are a number of groups working in parallel across the country, and there are efforts underway in a lot of those remaining states. There's a group called Wolfpack that is dedicated just to the convention as a tool to get this amendment. And they have been instrumental in getting those other 5 states to pass their convention calls, and they have people working on getting bills into, and there are a number of bills that have been introduced. I don't have the count off the top of my head right now, but there are a number that have been introduced, and others where groups are looking for people to get them introduced. So I don't have like a specific list of states for you, but there are people doing that work. So the follow-up question was, can the ratification process be carried out through a ballot initiative if the state legislatures refuse to ratify? And that particular part of the process is spelled out in the Constitution, that it has to be either the state legislature or a convention at the state level, so not a ballot initiative. But there is a question of whether a ballot initiative can count towards the 34 state threshold to trigger a convention. And there are people who are pursuing that strategy, including in Wyoming. Right now they're trying to put that on the ballot. And another point that was brought up in response is that we've seen an incredible response from voters in conservative states and liberal states. There's a split in the sort of parties and what they support at the federal level, but when you actually take it to the people, no matter what the political orientation of the state is, this question tends to win with supermajority support. In the back. The question is, let's say the left manages to take both houses of Congress in 2018 or 2020. Do I have a sense of whether they would then take this up and pass the amendment? And I don't, I can't see the future. My thought about that, my response to it is political winds can change incredibly quickly. The legislation that comes to mind off the top of my head is the Medicare for All legislation that has been introduced by John Conyers since 2003 and multiple times in the Senate by Bernie Sanders, and it's generally gotten very scant co-sponsorship. And we've reached this sort of tipping point where that issue has sort of caught fire, and now the number of co-sponsors in the House and the Senate are both increasing really rapidly compared to where we were before. So when Democrats controlled the Senate, there was an effort to pass, knowing that it would never pass through the House, to pass a version of a 28th Amendment. And so I definitely think it's like in the realm of possibility. And here's where the movement building, ground up part of what we're doing is so important, is that those elected officials respond to the incentives of like how they read the populace, right? How they read voters. And so if we have infrastructure built across the states, and if it really feels like there's a groundswell demanding this, it makes it that much more likely that left-leaning representatives and senators would be willing to actually fight for this. The question was, how does our statewide group connect to the national group that's working on this Move to Amend? If you were working on this with Move to Amend 5 years ago, we probably came close to crossing paths. There actually is a very clear connection there, because We the People Massachusetts grew out of Move to Amend's presence here in Massachusetts. The people who are involved in We the People Massachusetts today, almost all of us have been doing this for a number of years here, basically since Citizens United, and we're organizing under the banner of Move to Amend until we got to a point where our sort of local presence and infrastructure was built up to the point where we started feeling like it would better serve us to have the independence and autonomy of being a standalone statewide organization. So now we split from them and formed our own organization, and now consider them allies in the fight. What a great question from the audience. So Paul wanted to point out that I mentioned the grassroots nature of this movement. That to date, in Massachusetts, we've had something like 208 town and city resolutions passed, and it has passed with a supermajority everywhere. The worst that we ever did with this question was 66.7%, which is literally exactly the threshold for a supermajority. Everything else has been above that. But so as part of this process, a lot of the grassroots activists tend to be part of their Democratic town committee or Republican town committee. Massachusetts being overwhelmingly Democratic, we've had 60 Democratic town committees sign on in official formal support of the We the People Act. But he was putting out a call to those of us here in Lexington. The Lexington Democratic Town Committee has yet to hold a vote on this. They actually got a presentation similar to the one that I just gave. So if you have any sway, if you have a voice on that committee, let them hear it. So the question was, I can't be everywhere at once. How do we get these presentations to different parts of the state? So We the People Massachusetts actually has chapters all the way from one side of the state to the other, and we have a fleet of people who have now been trained to do this presentation, and we're growing that list of speakers every day. So we've got people who are available to go out in different parts of the state and speak to groups.